Right, good afternoon, and welcome to the Campus Conversation. This is our second Campus Conversation of the academic year. The goal of the Campus Conversation series is to have faculty, students, and staff engage with each other about some of the big issues of our time going on now and affecting all of us. As a community dedicated to social justice and diversity, we come together to try to understand current events and talk about issues. Over the past 3 years, we have looked at issues such as immigration, civil rights, national and local elections, and the hashtag #MeToo movement. Upcoming programs for the remainder of this academic year include food insecurity, free speech on campus, climate change, and Mayor Lightfoot's first year in office. Today, the topic is social media and mental health. We know that there are growing mental health needs in this country and at our colleges and universities. Perhaps one of the reasons is the influence of social media, which, although often a tool that helps us to connect and maintain friendships and learn about important activities locally, nationally, and internationally, it can also be very depressing. It seems like everyone is having a better time than you are, and their families and significant others are better looking than any of yours are. And we also know, of course, that a lot of bullying occurs on social media. I just read, I think in today's paper, or maybe yesterday's paper, about a suicide of a student who was bullied online. And so there's a lot here to talk about. Today we have our own Professor Zizi Papacharissi to lead a panel to address the issue of social media and public health, and she's here with two colleagues who are also experts in this field. So I will now introduce the panel and let Dr. Papacharissi take charge of the panel and the discussion. They will speak, the panelists will speak for a total of around 45 minutes, and then we will have 30 minutes left for Q&A. On your chairs, hopefully you found a piece of paper and a pencil, and that's for you to write your questions, and as we get closer to the Q&A time, Kelsey will come around and collect those and continue to keep her eye on them, and the panelists will have them to look at and respond to. So Dr. Zizi Papacharissi is professor and head of the communication department and a professor of political science at UIC and a university scholar at the University of Illinois System. Her work focuses on the social and political consequences of online media. She's published 9 books, over 70 journal articles and book chapters, and serves on the editorial board of 15 journals. I'm amazed you had time to join us today. Zizi is the founding and current editor of the open access journal Social Media and Society. She's collaborated with Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, and Oculus, and has participated in closed consultations with the Obama 2012 election campaign. She sits on the Committee on the Health and Well-Being of Young Adults, funded by the National Academies of Science, the National Research Council, and the Institute of Medicine in the U.S., and has been invited to lecture about her work on social media at several universities and research institutes in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Her work has been translated into Greek, German, Korean, Chinese, Hungarian, Italian, Turkish, and Persian. She is currently working on her 10th book titled After Democracy with the Yale University Press. Dr. Alexis Lauricella is an assistant professor and the director of the technology in the Early Childhood Center at the Erikson Institute here in Chicago, where she studies the intersecting fields of digital media and early childhood. Her research has been frequently published in academic journals and books, and she's a regular presenter at conferences in the United States and abroad. She interned at the Sesame Street Workshop, which solidified her passion for studying child development and media and led her to pursue a PhD in developmental psychology with a focus on studying educational media. She's also the founder of PlayLearnParent.com, a website that helps translate child development research for parents. She developed the site as a way of using technology to inform and support parents by providing them with small bits of child development information that can help guide them through some of the challenges of parenthood. I'm very sorry I was too late for that, or too early for that, maybe. Dr. Adrienne Massanari is an associate professor in the Department of Communication at UIC. Her research interests include new media, gaming, digital cultures, design, platform politics, gender, and ethics. Massanari's work has appeared in New Media and Society, Feminist Media Studies, First Monday, Journal of Computer Mediated Communication, and the Journal of Information Technology and politics. Prior to joining UIC, she served as the director for the School of Communications Center for Digital Ethics and Policy at Loyola University in Chicago. She also has more than 10 years' experience as a user researcher, information architect, usability specialist, and consultant in both corporate and educational settings. So this is a highly expert panel, and I will give you Dr. Papacharissi.
Thank you, Provost. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Provost Poser, thank you for creating this wonderful opportunity. This is certainly a timely topic, an important topic, and we're all very happy to be here. Thank you for attending this session. We look forward to the conversation. We each have some brief remarks, and then we'd love to engage in conversation with you and take your questions and do our best to answer them. I'm going to begin with some general remarks, providing an overview of my research and general expertise. I'm going to let Kelsey help me with pulling up my PowerPoint and start by telling you that I've been studying the internet and related platforms since the early 90s, when we had less than 5% of the population in the US with access or using these platforms and the medium, and less than 1% doing so worldwide. What we typically tend to find, and what I tend to find in my research over time, thank you. Hi. So what we tend to find time and time again is that people use the internet and the many platforms that it supports to get more of what they don't have enough of in their everyday lives. So for instance, people who are shy or introvert, they have more avenues for social connection. People who are much more social, they have many more ways with which they balance their social networks in a way that satisfies them. The internet is not some exotic, magical, mystical place that you dive into being social and you emerge out of being antisocial. Not at all. We tend to use the internet for connection, for expression, but really also to do just very mundane, boring, everyday things, things that we do in our daily routines, like looking up a recipe to finding a date. Now, there is nothing about the internet or the platforms that it supports that is inherently damaging to your mental stability or to your social well-being. But education, parenting, and peer groups are important. The internet is an architecture that supports a variety of spaces. Some of those spaces are going to be friendly to you, some of those spaces are going to be hostile, and almost all of those spaces are going to be what you make them. Let me go ahead and dispel some myths about social media that hover around these three questions. Do these media render people more or less social? No, they do not. We find time and time again that usually after a brief, fairly, period of enamorment with a new technology, people tend to fall back into their usual patterns or to find a way to integrate that technology, that medium into their daily routines in a meaningful manner, in a healthy manner. Most people, we do encounter addiction, but it's low and it's specific to people who have a predisposition for addictive behaviors. Point number two, I've always hated the term social media, and we use it we use it so much, and especially to describe platforms like Facebook, like Twitter. The reason why I hate this term is because it creates and it reproduces the impression that we have some media that are social, and Facebook and Twitter somehow ended up in that category. And then we have a separate category of media that are antisocial. And then perhaps there's other media that are asocial. They have no social properties at all. And this is a bizarre characterization, right? Because there's media like the telephone, which is very social medium, but it doesn't acquire that characterization of being a social medium compared to Facebook and Twitter. So all media are social. All media foster communication, and therefore, by definition, they're social. What's interesting is how each medium cultivates, reproduces, reinforces its own variety, texture of sociality, and sometimes, I think, with a lot of these platforms that are becoming more and more commercialized, its own brand of sociality, its own brand of being social. The last question is, are these spaces more social, less social? Human beings are social beings. Any space that we inhabit is going to be a social space. We're social by making. It's our survival strategy. So every space that we enter, we are going to make social, and we're going to enter it and inhabit it, bringing our habits and also our problems with us. So don't be surprised when you encounter harassment, bullying, hate speech, stalking online. The internet did not create those things. We brought them with us, and we brought them to a space that has the tendency, through its architecture, to make these things more visible, to allow them to spread more quickly. And Adrienne will talk about how that happens. Alexis will talk a little bit more about the circumstances under which we're likely to see addictive behaviors. What sort of groups are more vulnerable to these sorts of consequences, effects, let's say. So what to do about all of this? As the provost mentioned, every day you're saturated with information about other people, what they do, who they are, what they wear, where they're working, who they're dating. And the natural tendency is to compare. We've always done that. The difference is that in the past, we compared to our immediate social circle of 5, 10, 20 people. Nowadays, we're potentially comparing and self-comparing to millions of people every day. That can be maddening. And the only way out of this cycle that can be damaging for social well-being, for mental stability, is to realize that what you're looking at is ideal. It's aspirational. People go online to celebrate. We celebrate publicly, yet we mourn very privately. Remember that. People go online to celebrate, to project idealized versions of who they are. And the platforms that we're using create this illusion that we're looking onto other people's lives, into other people's worlds. But we're not. We're looking at a performance through a keyhole. We're not looking at the whole picture. We're not looking at the whole story. Also, play. Be imaginative, be creative, do your thing, don't imitate. And finally, resist. Put the phone down. You don't have to be, these technologies invite you to be social all the time. You don't have to be social all the time. And if you want to be social, well, diversify your portfolio. Pursue many different avenues to sociality. But really, find some time for silence. Give yourself the opportunity to be bored. That's where inspiration lies. Feel comfortable in that silence. One of my favorite social psychologists, Sherry Turkle, was often criticized for saying this, but I like what she says. She says that if we cannot find a way to be alone, we will always be lonely, right? Because we can be lonely in a room full of people, and we can be lonely when we're sitting by ourselves with our phones in our hands. So feel comfortable in that silence. Find a way to be alone and feel comfortable in that. It's not easy, and we all struggle with that. So let me leave you with this. I like to say that technologies network us, but it is our stories that connect us, identify us, and also potentially divide us. So tell the stories that express who you are. Tell them in ways that allow you to connect to each other and reach out to each other. And also, at the same time, don't squander your attention. Your attention is your power. Be selective. Don't fall prey to clickbait, to snack, to thirst traps. Don't be cheap dates. Play hard to get. Be hard to get. Thank you.
You guys hear me? Thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to be here. This is something that I love to do, is to talk about some of the research that I do with people who can actually use that information and do something about it. So I'm going to jump right in, talking about social media and mental health. I want to start with headlines like this, right? Have smartphones destroyed a generation? A lot of the public conversation that we see and hear around technology, and especially social media, focuses on destruction and how one particular tool, like Zizi was getting at, social media, that Facebook, that Twitter, that is causing all these problems. We see this in a lot of headlines, a lot of rhetoric is really focusing on, again, these very specific components and forgetting about all the other aspects of human development and humans' lives. And this is where my work really comes in. So instead of focusing on one technology or one way of using the internet or social media, I use what is Bronfenbrenner's model. You don't have to worry about that too much, but this idea that people, individuals, are surrounded by all these really important aspects of their lives. Things like school, family, culture, policies, right? All these things that influence how we behave and how we feel and how we learn. And so thinking about social media as one instance, one thing that could destroy a generation, from my perspective, is literally a little bit too short-sighted, too small, right? We're forgetting about all the other protective factors, all the other things that are going on when you focus on something like just social media. All of the parts of our lives influence how we feel, how we respond, how we engage, and we need to keep that in mind, that we are not little tiny organisms. We are big, intellectual, and impressive people who can make a lot of decisions based on a lot of different information. So no one person or one thing is really influenced by just one other aspect. When I do my work, most of my work is on children through adolescence, and some young adult work as well. But I really am interested in how people develop and how they change and how they learn in the context of media technology. So I frame my work around these three separate kind of ideas, these three aspects that are important when you're considering about the effect of social media or the effect of any technology on an individual. Thinking about the individual who's using that particular technology, thinking about the content, what that individual is actually doing or using or engaging with, and then the context for how you're using that technology. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how these three variables and these three factors really influence these effects of social media. The individual user matters. If you're 5, if you're 7, if you're 15, if you're my mother, who is now 73, the way she uses technology impacts how it affects her, right? Her experiences, she projects her own experiences into the use with social media. She also experiences it differently based on her life and experience. So we need to think about who is using it, what type of characteristics, not just age, but own experiences, right? We all have been in a situation where we've been on social media looking at the same image or reading the same text and processing it very differently than our neighbor or our friend, or not recognizing how that might hurt somebody else because they're coming at it from a very different perspective. So we need to think about the user, just ourselves as the user, but also who might be seeing what you're posting and how they might be responding differently than the way you would. One particular aspect of the user that we should think about that Zizi kind of already alluded to is this idea of vulnerability, right? And that is not necessarily based on any kind of diagnosis, but even just vulnerability of that particular day. You all know that when you wake up and you're in a great mood, things don't hit you and don't bother you as much than if you wake up in a bad, crummy mood or you just failed a test. Seeing somebody's perfect life on social media is going to feel even worse, right? So there's been a lot of research looking at these aspects of vulnerability and how people with different vulnerabilities respond and feel differently when they're engaging with social media. This is some work by Common Sense Media that was just done last year. And they were looking at kids who identified as vulnerable in a variety of different social emotional ways. What I think is really interesting here is that kids who were vulnerable teens were more likely to say that they had a variety of negative responses to social media, such as feeling bad about themselves when nobody commented on their own posts. Also, they said that they were also more likely to say that social media has a positive rather than a negative effect on them. So we've got both of these things happening at the same time, and we need to recognize that, again, that this is just not a direct linear relationship, but a lot of feelings are going into the use of social media and experiences all at the same time. And so it's hard to kind of determine what is healthy use, what's not healthy use, when to put it away, when to keep it out, and we need to recognize that. Again, just some data. This is the dark purple bars are looking at our youth with low social emotional well-being, whereas the lighter purple is the high social emotional well-being. And you see here some considerable differences, right? So in the top corner it says, this is the percent of social media users who say that they sometimes feel left out or excluded when they're using social media. Youth with low social emotional well-being are more likely to say that compared to those with higher social emotional well-being. They're more likely to say that they feel bad about themselves if no one comments on their posts. They've said they've deleted social media posts because they got so few likes, etc. So this just has some data to the point that there are these aspects of the individual user that really influence the effects of it. Another similar data point and chart, again from Common Sense Media. These are, again, youth who say that social media makes them feel lonely, more or less lonely, and we see that 39% say that it makes them feel more lonely, 13% says it makes them feel less lonely, 13% say it makes them feel more lonely, things like depressed and better and worse about themselves. And again, this is very generalized. We all have felt these different feelings. It's really hard to look at our own behavior and say, overall, does this make me feel better or worse? Whereas in a specific instance, you might pull something up and be like, oh, this makes me feel better, or this doesn't make me feel better. So you have to be careful about these types of measurements in general also. Context matters. Again, this is another important thing to think about with your own social media use. How are you engaging with the social media? Are you sitting on the train with your headphones and head down looking at your feeds? Are you sitting in your bedroom? I have a 14-year-old and her bedroom is in the basement and she wants to go down in the dark basement and look at her social media and do different things. Again, back to Zizi's point, this is not just that she's sitting on Instagram. She's on Instagram, she's chatting, she's FaceTiming, she's doing a lot of social behaviors that are all social media in a variety of different ways in a context that's very isolating. So we have a rule, we have 4 kids and she's the oldest, and so the rule is she can use her phone, has to be in the living room where all the other kids are gonna run into her. She's gonna have to fend for herself and focus on other things as she's engaging with that social media. And you all have seen this too, when you're engaging and looking at something together with a friend, it feels different. The content also matters, right? So it's not just thinking about social media as a whole, but what you're seeing, who's presenting it, and how it makes you feel. These different images, all taken from different social media accounts, will have different impacts on the users and on those, depending on those own individual users' feelings about the content being presented. This might be particularly upsetting for some people and not at all for other people, right? And we need to recognize what triggers us to feel good or bad and how we respond to that. Similarly, this is actually a group of all of my good girlfriends from graduate school, except for one, right? And so we posted it to social media, and you can imagine that made her feel particularly bad that she was excluded and not part of that get-together. I'm gonna bring in a little bit of theory for a second, this idea of cultivation theory, because it's kind of important. Cultivation theory says, quickly, that what you see, especially represented on media and in different experiences, you start to feel like that's what the real world is. And that's a particularly important thing to think about. If all you're seeing is people's keyhole best images, best presentations being put forward, you kind of forget that the rest of their world and the rest of everybody's world has all these other different components that are never getting represented in those different contexts. I'm just gonna skip through that last one. I wanna talk about one recent study that we did that was not on social media, but I think puts this into context a little bit. We recently did a study on the show, 13 Reasons Why, which a lot of people know about. and had a lot of criticisms. And what we actually were interested in is what did the viewers of this show feel after watching this show? How did they change their behavior? What were they doing as a function of watching the show or not watching the show? And one of the really interesting findings that we had a lot of findings, was that viewers were actually more likely to talk about the tough topics that were presented in the show with a lot of other people in their real lives, with parents, with teachers, with peers. They were more comfortable and more willing to talk about things like mental health, depression, suicide. And 31% said that they talked about this show on social media. So again, this shows a couple of different things. One, social media is not separate. It's not that's what I go do in social media, but it's a part of all of our lives, and we communicate on social media and we communicate in our real world. But we need to think about, especially with young users, when they're choosing to communicate on what platforms and when they're skipping out on other ways of being social or engaging in different experiences. So just in summary, recognizing there's a whole lot that goes into this social media and mental health category, and that we need to be very aware of all of the different pieces around the individual and how they're interacting or not interacting when we're really trying to figure out and understand what effect it has on youth and mental health. Thank you.
Okay, can actually, I'll turn this on. We'll go this way. Okay. Hi. Thanks so much for coming today to talk about this really important topic. Probably some of the things I'm going to say will sound like a refresher course in what you've just heard, because I think we're all sort of saying some of the same things, and I'm hoping that some of this is resonating with you as well. So my research broadly considers sort of the relationships between communities, online spaces, so Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, and the ways in which platform design can sort of facilitate conversations or impede them in different ways. And in particular, I'm interested in this sort of question of like, how do these platforms perhaps suppress marginalized voices, and how does extremist content get spread? When we're thinking about platforms generally and social media platforms, I'm going to use platforms as a term. So, it's important for us to think about sort of how they are designed. And this is something that most of us don't maybe have much familiarity with, but it's, I think, kind of once I start talking about it a little bit, you'll get where I'm going with this. We can think about them as having certain affordances. And so the idea of affordance is simply how something in the environment tells us how it works. So for example, if I see a door and it has a metal plate on it, I know I'm supposed to push that door outward. Or if I see a box online that says, a comment box, please add something here, I'm supposed to add something to this conversation. Or I'm supposed to click a button to say that I liked it or pinned it or whatever. When we think about affordances in social media, I think there's a few that are really particularly salient and important, and some of these are ones that we've already talked about. So first is this notion of amplification. So social media is essentially there to amplify our message. So that means our words and photos and memes often move far beyond the audience that we anticipated. So if we tweet a joke on Twitter, it might be retweeted or screen capped and then posted on Tumblr or Reddit, and it might go viral. And we may have no control over that. And this may be great, or it may be not so great, depending on the situation, in part because it encourages this sort of loss of context. And that's one of the things, we don't know necessarily when we retweet something, all of the other things that person has ever posted. And so we could actually end up amplifying material that's harmful or misleading very easily. And conversely, also, we can also think about the fact that this then might lead us to amplify or to be overwhelmed by material that is, that we're hitting us all the time, all the day, every day, as we get another notification on our phone that some sort of major news story has just broken. It's because everything seems to demand our attention, and so we may not be as thoughtful as we want to be about what we're sharing and consuming. Second, I think affordance that's really important for us to consider is visibility. Social media are designed to promote visibility and communication. This means that things like Black Lives Matters and Me Too activists can mobilize in really important ways, and it collapses the distance between individuals and communities. But that also means that spaces like Twitter can easily facilitate harassment campaigns against targeted others. And those people targeted often are those the most marginalized among us. It also means that, like our other two sort of speakers have talked about today, that we do this constant comparison of ourselves and others. We forget that everyone's curating themselves all the time, online and offline. And so we look to these spaces for validation about how we should be living, also knowing that that's not really them, but it feels like it is them. And this connects to a third affordance, feedback. So likes, shares, retweets, upvotes, and pins are all sort of metrics designed into social media to tell us how well we're doing with our audience, how much is resonating with them. But it's easy for us to view this as sort of a larger statement about our inherent worth. When an Instagram post we share doesn't get as many likes as another one, we maybe have a tendency to think that this is about us, our friends no longer liking us, or our audience has moved to another platform or something like that, without realizing that there's a design element. So perhaps the algorithm that's being used isn't actually showing that post for a given reason. And we can also think about the fact that experiences online continually reinforce a viewpoint, which may be awesome. So say we have a health concern, there's probably a Reddit community for that where we can share and vent and receive social support for that concern. But that feedback and that feedback loop can also work in reverse. So we can find support for harmful behaviors or extremist ideas or become radicalized because of that. So positive feedbacks in those kinds of communities can create and maintain an echo chamber, along with sort of algorithms that also recommend more kind of content and perhaps move people towards more extremist beliefs. I do want to mention that technology itself is not neutral. So it reflects a certain particular set of assumptions about what appropriate use is and the values of those people creating it. It's been designed to keep us liking and sharing content, and because this makes money. It's not really designed for our collective or personal well-being. That's not the primary design purpose. This might be changing sort of as social media companies are now being somewhat regulated, perhaps in the US. And we can see this in their attempts to sort of make incremental changes, like not showing likes, for example, unless you're the author of a post, or keeping them hidden for a certain amount of time to encourage people not to over-amplify material. But we know it's really telling when many folks in Silicon Valley themselves very much limit the amount of screen time that their children have. So that would perhaps say something about what use looks like or what they think might be doing to us. And while it may be easy to just say, well, you should delete your Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, there's often a really very real social and professional cost to doing so. So until a few years ago, I assigned a media fast to my students. And I'm not really sure that such an assignment is actually even possible anymore. So this was about new media. They would fast from new media. And we're ever more connected, and asking students to simply ignore a critical part of their lives as if it's somehow separate from their real lives is not really feasible. There'd be too much of a cost to them. I do think we have as a responsibility as educators to help students think critically about their habitual social media use, reflecting on how it makes them feel, right? To that end, some of my colleagues have designed a more nuanced version of the social media fast, which actually has students kind of taping or sort of videotaping, digitally recording their faces as they're doing different tasks online, and then playing it back and reflecting on what they see in their faces. And sometimes that led to some fairly significant changes in how they were engaging with social media. They had no idea that whenever they went on Facebook, they got really sad looking, and felt bad. Hadn't really even internalized that until they saw these images of themselves engaging with this. I do want to say lastly that one of the most important things we need to consider with social media is, and I think this isn't new information, is that this reflects larger cultural tendencies, right? So when we talk about issues of cyberbullying or harassment or radicalization, it's easy to say that technology has created the problem. And while it definitely amplifies certain tendencies, we do a huge disservice to everyone if we continue to look to technology as being simply the problem, as if technology is going to solve the problem for us also. We have larger sort of social issues that need to be wrestled with, which are much more difficult and complex and complicated. But I think that, along with thinking about how these affordances work, is something really a productive way for us to move forward and to understand what we are doing with technology and social media and what it is doing with us as well. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
For some very insightful remarks that added a lot of specificity to the conversation and the concerns and the questions we all have. I have a couple questions for our panelists while we gather questions from all of you to get the conversation started. So would you mind telling us about a learning moment, a teaching experience, teaching moment in your own personal experience with using social media and how you were able to find balance and well-being in that experience? And I will answer that question myself too, if there's time.
Sure. So I think there's been multiple learning experiences, especially as a parent of a teen, but in my own use as well. Just recognizing and reflecting on how I'm feeling when I see certain images has been really powerful. And as much as it's hard, making a change and removing some of the people that are not necessarily, and of no fault of their own. It's often my own issues. I have a good friend from high school who has 3 beautiful little kids, and something about every time she posts with her little tiny toddlers and her house being perfectly clean, it just makes me feel awful. And she's not doing anything wrong. But I just realized I couldn't do it. It was not bringing me enough joy to see how cute her babies were, even when, just because it was making me so crazy about my own issues about our house not being clean. And so I had to remove her. And it's one of those things that was hard, and I felt kind of guilty about doing it. But it was helpful for me to not have to be sparked by that every single time I saw it.
Yeah, I would say, so one of the things that I've noticed is if I'm watching a show and I'm on my phone, I didn't really want to be watching the show much or be on my phone, either one of those. And I think being one of the things that I've learned is sort of like how to, what is it that, what am I trying to get at? So like the thinking about the sort of, the uses and gratifications of what I'm trying to get at that particular moment with my technology use, whatever that is, right? So am I just like trying to zone out, flipping through, TikTok videos over and over again? And at some point I've learned that I need to put a sort of time limit, because I could just very easily descend into TikTok for hours and watch cute cat videos. But it's interesting that I have to be much more disciplined than I thought I would have to be. It's like we study this stuff, and I still struggle with all the things that our students, I think everyone does, which is not picking up the phone and looking immediately for an answer to a question, or not doing this. And it is almost like I also sometimes, if I'm thinking about it, meditate, and like that, that mindfulness, there's a reason that exists as a practice. And perhaps part of this is about becoming just more, I think for me personally, attuned to why am I using it? What am I really trying to get at? Am I trying to procrastinate? Am I trying to feel bad? Because sometimes I use social media to feel bad about me, because that's my own personal mental state. Or am I trying to, or am I really interested in connection? And those are different kinds of reasons to use it.
I can definitely sympathize with that. And I want to share with all of you that that person that I was describing and I was referring to when I said, find time to be silent, feel comfortable in that silence. That was me, because for people like me, I have trouble sitting still. I like to do a lot of different things at the same time. So for people like me, this can be a very empowering tool. It allows me to do a lot of things at the same time, can also be very dangerous. So for me, it's been very helpful to just kind of keep an eye on the things that I'm doing, and also finding some time to just put the phone down and look out the window or just stare at the ceiling and do nothing. Can be very fulfilling, staring at the ceiling. Any advice that you have for students?
Try not to use your phone in class. I know it's super tempting. I mean, I would say that it's a habit. It's like, this is habitual stuff. And I think a lot of times, I think of our phones as like the new, what cigarette smoking was once upon a time. Like, it gives you a reason for being there, right? If you're standing outside a bar with your friends, or you're standing outside a restaurant waiting for people, it's very easy to be scrolling up and down, because it's like, it's a way to kind of show the world that you belong there, in the way that it used to be if you'd smoke cigarettes, you'd stand outside a bar and do that. I think in some ways that's, I see students in my classes, and I have all kinds of technology in these classes, and oftentimes they're really relevant for whatever we're doing. But I can just see it. It's like you watch it happen, where as much as, they're on, we're all sort of on task, we all sort of start veering off into some other world. And that's not necessarily bad. That's kind of this like sort of world in which we live right now. But it does also mean it's more difficult for us to be present with each other in this sort of special space that I think we create in the classroom setting. And I think also the other piece of this is, there's lots of great tools. I mean, if you want to look to the technology to help you fix the technology, that's maybe sometimes a good idea, sometimes not. But there are these great tools to like limit your use, and maybe just even trying it out and seeing if it's different. If you move like if you move Snapchat off of your, your desktop, your phone screen, your lock screen or whatever, if you move it into some hidden folder, does that change your things? Like, sort of doing your own sort of social experiments on yourself to see if that helps. I don't know. That would be my suggestion.
Yeah, I think those are, I think actually what you said initially, picking one thing to be doing at a time, and then giving all of your attention to whatever that one thing is. If you want to do social media, if you want to do TikTok, if you want to do Snapchat, then do that, and do it for that period of time that you've decided, and then move on, and make sure you kind of make those agreements with yourself. Again, I work with kids, so I do a lot on like games and activities and ways to help them not want to continue a habit or a behavior. And so reward yourself, like find ways that if you do stop and do other things, that you get some sort of a reward for that behavior. Or especially I taught a class when I was at Northwestern with undergrads, and we went through all the ways that they tried to police themselves and their friends. And so they had a whole bunch of games where if they went out to dinner, everybody put their phone on the middle of the table, and whoever reached for the phone first had to pay for dinner, or whatever it was. So there's a big consequence, right? So thinking about different ways to kind of help yourself remember that maybe you don't need to be on it all the time, or that you can take a break, I think is a really good recommendation. And making it part of your social group, because it's hard when you're standing outside the bar and everybody else is on their phone and you're the one looking at the ceiling. And so think about ways to kind of encourage each other to engage with each other off of the devices as well.
I mean, it strikes me that the advice that we have to offer does not deviate too much from the advice that we offer generally regarding living a balanced and fulfilling life. A friend of mine who does research on social media likes to start his lectures by saying, "You are not special." And I think he really revels in saying that. But I think it's important to emphasize that, because you're not special, my snowflakes. And by that I mean, it's interesting, the thing about social media and specific platforms that we use under the huge moniker social media is that they do create this illusion that you are special. When you begin your day, they invite you to talk about how you're feeling or to offer your opinion. So there is that lure that, you are special, and tell us what is special about you. So we do tend to project the aspirational on these platforms. We're invited to sort of present the best version of ourselves. And I think the trick here is to do that, but also to understand that we're special, and at the same time we're very similar. So yes, we use these technologies to celebrate how special and unique we are, but we also use them to understand that we share a lot of the similar problems, a lot of the same problems with the people that we're speaking to, and to use them then to connect with people around these problems. It strikes me that I can use this last point to transition into one of the questions from the audience. So it's building community, coalitions, friendships, positive for mental health, or does it promote getting further lost in the world of the internet and distancing ourselves from the, quote, real world, unquote, as these connections become a sort of reality?
I think it's a net positive. You know, I mean, we talk a lot, there's like sort of a term that's deridedly used as Slacktivism, right? Which is like, oh, I retweeted something, a petition, or I did this. I mean, but when we like look at it for activists, like social media is a huge, really, really like formational thing that has allowed activists around the world to do some pretty remarkable things. And so I think that just saying that it's just sort of this nonsensical thing that hasn't, what it works is activists are using it to organize on the ground sort of actions, right? To go and to protest, to go and to march, to go and to raise awareness. And I mean, you could just look at sort of the cultural, like, sort of importance of something like Me Too or Black Lives Matters. It's sort of say that, real social change can happen. And certainly it facilitates a larger group of people coming together. That being said, it also facilitates another kind of group, of people that come together to engage in harassment campaigns, right? So those same affordances are, kind of on both sides, right? They're dualities, they allow for both. And, I do think that while we might have the impulse to think that social media distances us because we have the screen that seems cold, I would say for most of us, I mean, throughout your day, you've probably have smiled, laughed, maybe gotten sad, looking at something. So there is this like affective thing, as Zizi mentioned, that happens when we're engaging with these spaces that doesn't just have to do with this non-material, like other world that exists out here. It is grounded in our bodies and is experienced by them. And so, I mean, I think, yeah, that would be my perspective.
And since we're on the topic, what do you think about echo chambers, the ways in which they may support delusional thinking?
Yeah.
Well,
I feel like, I know that they're not supposed to exist, right? That's according to certain, the filter bubble.
The filter bubble. I think it's an interesting question. Some of my work focuses on the social consequences of social media and media in general. Some of it focuses on the political, and often I end up looking at both. So something that I like to say is that echo chambers, yes, they exist, but they're not something new. I think they've always existed. They exemplify behaviors that we adopt as we try to find friends. We usually associate with others by trying to look for the similar. We're looking for people who we may have similarities with, we may have common interests with. So that's the motivation behind echo chambers is not evil. They're not created to support and sustain delusional thinking. But they have always existed, and they have always been supported by media. So what we're seeing here is part human tendency to affiliate and to find people who are like-minded and to make friends with them, but also a lack of knowledge in terms of how to then circulate and express our opinions online, how to have conversations online, and understanding that not every space is suited for every kind of conversation. So just like you might have a private conversation at home in a quiet space, a flirtatious conversation in a crowded bar with a lot of other people, or no conversation at all in a movie theater because you're watching a film. Same thing with the internet. There's some conversations that are better had online, some conversations that are better had online. There's some opinions that you may express, you may want to express, you feel you want to express, but you don't have to have an opinion about everything. And I often feel that there's this pressure to have an opinion. And of course, we live in a democracy, we have the right to our opinion. But what I often ask is, have we earned the right to that opinion? Do we know enough about a certain situation to have earned the right to that opinion? So yes, I think we encounter delusional thinking and echo chambers in social media, perhaps more often, because they do have the tendency to amplify, to make more visible, to proliferate. And my solution to that, my answer to that is education, literacy. I'm Greek, so we say in Greek, just dipping your tongue in your brain before you talk. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think it kind of comes back to what I was talking about before, too, of thinking about things a little more holistically. So what's going on with the individuals who are perpetuating conversations in these echo chambers? What else is going on in their lives? Are they not being exposed to other stories, other thoughts, other opinions? And I think that's something to think about, either in your own behavior or when you're in these situations when you're reading through comments and people are constantly agreeing or getting more and more angry about something. Put that hat on of what's going on. Where is this person coming from with this conversation? Are they just sitting at home reading all these chats and responding? Are they at a university where they're hearing different perspectives and thinking about things differently? Just being aware that it's not the platform, but it's the people that are engaging in these behaviors, and we need to help make sure that people are experiencing diverse experiences so that they don't get kind of caught up in just one train on some level.
Okay, so bottom line, do we think social media is better or worse for mental health? I think it's like chocolate, so I like it. If I eat it every day, and if it's all I eat, it's going to be really bad for me. But if I eat it in a balanced way, it's going to be very healthy. So same thing with social media. They present specific avenues of being social. If used in a particular way, they can enhance balance, they can enhance well-being. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the jury's still out, right? This is like asking, it's a great question, but it is like asking us before we have the retrospective, however many years later, to think about this. I think this is one of the challenges, right, is that we have, it's not like we haven't had other media technologies that have come out and people have divisive reactions to it. That is like part and parcel of how we engage with new technology. There is sort of this techno-utopian optimism, and then there's this sort of dystopian, everything's going to be terrible, we're going to have the apocalypse happen because of this technology. That's always been the case. I do think what's happened now is that, these are really important conversations to be having. The issue is, are they happening enough? Are these conversations, and are we all on equal enough footing to understand technologically what the affordances, design, technologies of social media platforms are doing? And I would say no, most of us aren't. I'm not necessarily. Like, they're pretty much, contained in this, perhaps we don't have the programmatic knowledge to understand them, but also, we haven't really had them long enough for us to become sort of accustomed to them in the same way that we might the television or newspaper. And they're also technically complex. Like, I still don't know how my computer works. Like, I know theoretically how it works, but I marvel when it turns on, and it actually turns on. And the minute that it gets sad and doesn't turn on, I'm freaking out. But it's like I think part of this is, are we leading this? Are we doing this, are we thinking about the sort of ethical and value-based questions at the forefront of these technological developments? Probably not. And maybe that's something we might want to start thinking more about, especially as we move beyond sort of just social media, but thinking about AI and a lot of other sorts of technologies that we already know are sort of in development, to think about how do we want to create really sort of just and humane spaces, and what does that look like for us? And that means having a really hard conversation about what does that look like now? Because we don't necessarily have it together in this space either.
Alexis, I have a question directed for you specifically. Can you elaborate more on the differences between those high versus low on social emotional well-being?
Sure, I can explain a little bit more about it. So if you are interested in more of that data, there's a huge report by Common Sense Media that looked directly at teens' use of social media and did a survey and asked things on a whole host of levels around social and emotional development and how teens self-reported how they felt in these different variables. They also then went and talked to teens and did focus groups so that they got more of a holistic perspective of what teens were talking about regarding social media. And one of the big findings, again, around that was that teens and youth see this differently than older generations, right? So this is their world, and they don't, I will put all of us into an age group that we didn't grow up with this. And so we are constantly, and other researchers are constantly comparing how we grew up with how this next generation grew up. And that's not how adolescents and teens and young adults are doing it. They're not sitting down thinking, should I Snapchat or should I call? This is the world that they've grown up in. This is how they behave. And so sometimes when we put kind of our old people lens onto this, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Regarding the high and low social emotional development, they had a scale that assessed different questions of how adolescents generally reported how lonely they felt, how confident they felt in social interactions and different engagement situations, and then they broke the group into people who fell lower on the scale and higher on the scale, and they found that those two different groups of people responded differently to how they felt when they were using social media. We did something similar with the 13 Reasons Why study, where we looked at people who were higher and lower on loneliness, on happiness, on self-esteem, on depression, to see how those individual differences, how if you fell on a high or low level of those variables, how watching 13 Reasons Why might have impacted you differently.
Thank you. There's actually a question that picks up on a couple of things that both of you mentioned, including the old person lens and also experience with past media. Would our advice work for current students who grew up with social media? They don't have a memory of a time where it didn't exist. I would say yes, while you think on this. I would say yes, because a lot of the advice that I give comes from conversations with young people. And the more we talk with young people, the more we realize that they're very sensitive to these issues. They're very aware of some of the dangers that are out there and also the opportunities as well. And they're very media savvy. Now, regarding a memory of a time where these things didn't exist, yes, they didn't, but I mean, and I'm guessing this is not coming from a current student. Let's all think back at a time when we were at that age, and we were looking and struggling with things that didn't previously exist. We didn't have a memory of them, and the sorts of crazy and unexpected things that we wanted to do that were part of growing up and experimenting with life and making some mistakes and learning from them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of perhaps difference now is that, and it is, I mean, it should be of some concern, is sort of like the longevity of those moments, right? When we have this sort of, I mean, I went through some serious awkwardness, teenage awkwardness. There are pictures that I don't want anybody seeing, and they're safely in my parents' house, and they will probably never see the light of day, right? And so we can think, though, that this is, there is something different, and it is why sort of sometimes the advice is so partial or not sort of keeping with this, is like the idea of this moment being lived in a, sort of public way that is somewhat different than for many of us who didn't grow up with all of this available to us. That part is probably pretty concerning, or sort of like thinking about the sort of ramifications of the longevity of, you know, terrible decisions you made as a teenager. I think that all of us probably had that, and sort of the question of like, I mean, maybe it means that everybody's, like at some point it will be just a cascade, everybody will have done that, and it'll be all online, and therefore it will have zero consequence to anyone. But we also know right now we're sort of in this transitional period where people are having to be confronted with the sort of possible like prior selves that they had, you know, expressions of that are uncomfortable, that even now they would kind of look at and say, oh, I would do things very differently. And they're doing it in a way that can be easily, you know, again, made visible, amplified, kind of passed around, decontextualized. And that I think is, I mean, that's certainly, that's different. And that's where, you know, but there's also a lot of adults throwing up their hands as if they have no ability to say anything about this new space. And it's like, and yet half of them are the ones who designed it to begin with. So,
That's a very good point.
You know, so I mean, I think there's sort of that too, is also thinking about, again, these are issues that teenagers in particular and young people have faced time in memoriam. You know, what's being codified is now it's being done a little bit more publicly in a space that's different than it was before.
Yeah, I'm often pleasantly surprised, you know, by your students, by young people's ability to self-correct. And I was thinking on the point that you made, you know, about these photographs that go online and stay online forever. And lately, you know, a growing trend in social media is for younger adults to favor the more ephemeral ways of exposure. So to go for things like Snap, to use Instagram stories, to use options that, you know, allow them to tell stories about who they are without having to commit to displaying a digital trace of their identity and implanting that online forever.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of this sort of, you know, sort of attempts in, especially in EU countries, to think about the right to be forgotten, right? So the idea is that these digital traces are something that perhaps, I mean, I think Andrew Yang just today said that we should be owning, right? We should have access to our digital data, and the thinking about creative ways that you might be able to, you know, kind of rewrite yourself. I mean, we do it a million times during our lives. This is just a new kind of version of it.
One other thing, I guess, just from the thinking about some of these new social media where things do disappear, and I think it's hard for a lot of us to do the research on it because it's disappearing. But talking to youth and talking about how, if you talk to college students and adolescents about how they're using Snapchat, it's very different than the conversations that we're talking about how they're using the more permanent social media platforms. They get it. They get that this is going to disappear, and on some level, there's an opportunity. Actually, the picture that you saw of the two little girls is my daughter making a funny face, and that was on something that was going to disappear. And I took a screenshot of her story. But this idea that kids are willing to not come out perfectly in those immediate and going to disappear stories is really interesting when you think about what people are exposed to, right? And so this conversation about everybody putting their best foot forward is very accurate when we're thinking about Facebook and Instagram and even Twitter. But Snapchat, it's different. There's a lot more silliness. There's a lot more playing going on. There's a lot more experimenting going on. And so we're seeing even the behaviors changing based on the platform and how it's being used by these youth, which is important to consider also.
Thank you for these questions are amazing. Thank you so much for all. We're going to do 2 more questions, and then I think we have to wrap things up because of time. Can we talk a little bit, there's a request to talk a little bit more about the affordances of social media, and if there are any affordances that promote positive mental health. So one way to think about this is that, I mean, affordances are, I mean, they certainly tend to promote or prohibit specific behaviors, but they're also kind of like attributes or characteristics. So they can be used to promote behaviors that are healthy. It can also be sort of gamed with to promote behaviors that are unhealthy. Something that I've always appreciated regarding mental health is that often And we've also spent, I see some of my colleagues in the audience, we spent a lot of time studying safe spaces online, how they are enabled, how they're fostered, and how anonymity often creates a safe haven for sharing and finding people who are going through the same thing, the same difficult situation, and supporting each other, support communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be the dream of a site like Reddit, which it doesn't always accomplish, and it seriously does not accomplish in a lot of ways. But Reddit is a sort of community-based website. Anyone can create a community of interest, and the amazing thing about it is if you are struggling with anything, right? Like if you want advice about what's going on in a relationship, if you need to talk to somebody about self-harm, those kinds of things. I mean, that social support stuff, I think, is what is kind of amazing. And for many of us who study the internet, really think it's powerful about these spaces. And to be, to not just facilitate that, but also to do things like, so the affordance of having pseudo-anonymity, which means that you have a persistent username, but you're not tied to a real name of, account. On a space like Reddit really does afford people the ability to disclose about themselves incredibly painful things sometimes in a space that feels less like a barrier to entry than they might with family or friends for lots of other reasons, or family or friends in their other spaces. And these people become sort of, especially if you're dealing with some sort of health issue, any kind of health issue, being able to go to a place where everyone else is also struggling with that same thing and understands that is incredibly powerful and profound. And I think that these are pockets that exist. I mean, there are people who are doing that in spaces like Facebook groups. There's lots of secret Facebook, it sounds so secretive, lots of secret Facebook groups. I mean, I belong to some that are for social support or various things that are for this very small community of people. I mean, maybe part of this is also when we start thinking about where is social media, like, is it breaking down, or these conversations, like maybe we're trying at too large a scale to have some of these conversations. Maybe that's part of the issue, is that we think that this is going to be able to facilitate, millions of people in a room together. Well, that's absurd. Like, we wouldn't be able to do that anyway. And so thinking about what scale of, back to what Zizi was saying, sort of where is it appropriate to have certain conversations and have an opinion or not in certain situations, that would be maybe this is a really one of the affordances. It's really tiny communities that allow people to, share something that's really important to them, and that's meaningful. And I think that is a positive mental health benefit.
And I also think the same features of social media that make people feel kind of overly confident, either criticizing somebody or saying something negative, bullying behavior, also helps some people feel confident enough to bring up their own concerns. So you see a lot with adolescents and with young adults, this idea of they are much more comfortable texting or even responding to an Instagram Instagram account with things like, I'm feeling really upset, like I'm feeling really down. The word suicide, unfortunately, is coming up a lot in young conversations, and it's happening through these text-based conversations, partially because it's really hard to look somebody in the face and say, hey, I'm feeling really depressed, especially if you are feeling really depressed. And so there are these affordances through these types of digital communication that do, and especially on individual levels, let certain people feel more comfortable asking for help or talking about their mental health or their own emotions. Whether or not that's the best place for them to be doing it is a different conversation, but there is that opportunity there that didn't exist 30 years ago when, if you were feeling really down, you could write a letter. I mean, what else were you going to do unless you're going to talk to somebody directly or on the phone?
I would just say, look, the medium itself, lends itself to companionship, to expression. People looked for companionship online before they looked for everything else. I think things become problematic when there's efforts to commercialize that aspect of companionship, to put a brand on it, to misuse words and then sort of lump all of your acquaintances in one place, label them as friends, and then sell them to you, sell them to other people. I think those are ways to exploit the the platform commercially are usually misguided. And I think this connects to the last question that we have for today, which is sort of a two-part question. I also wanted to connect it to a question I wanted to ask. So what can universities do about this? How do we get our students to think critically about social media? And then also, how do we identify problems before they get out of hand? And let me first say that one way to identify problems before they get out of hand is to start working. Something that our colleagues have been doing in communication, start working with the companies that design these platforms, and start involving ourselves in advisory roles so that we can have a part in what these platforms look like and what sort of behaviors they encourage. But how do we get our students to get more critically, and what part can faculty, can universities play?
I mean, we could say they should be comm majors, but so we could talk about this in our classes. Yeah, I mean, I think having these conversations and thinking about how to, not just this kind of conversation, but where appropriate in the fields that we're each in, and kind of bringing the conversation to about demystifying this thing. Mm-hmm. Because I think what's happened is that both, you know, older adults have often thrown up their hands and just sort of said, I don't understand it, I don't get it, like, I'm just gonna sort of abdicate responsibility for understanding this. And I think, unfortunately, that does a disservice both to, you know, students, young people, by suggesting that somehow all of the things that they've dealt with, so things like literacy, you know, we've been dealing with issues around media literacy for years, right? And sort of thinking about information literacy and, you know, and issues around like mental health, all that stuff. We have all this knowledge, and it may not be 100% applicable to social media context, but a lot of it is. And I think that part of the problem, you know, is there's been a reticence to have conversations, to sort of talk about it, to, I mean, people, every single time I've brought it up in my classes, I mean, students are both far more reflective than you might expect them to be about their own use of stuff, but also less knowledgeable about the nuts and bolts of what these platforms do, right, and how they do it. And I think that that's part of the piece that us old people can offer some context and guidance and like historicize this, create some context around it. And, you know, yeah, so that would be my suggestion.
Alexis?
I think another
quickly.
Yeah, sure. A quick suggestion is to also recognize, again, in orientations and when students are starting in schools, to start that this is part of their lives that they're bringing with them. And in the same way that in history, when we've had new students come, we've had to help them know how to do their laundry and do all these other sort of specific tasks that we also need to help them adjust to college and social media in college. And that's part of what they're dealing with every day. So kind of getting, again, ahead of it and starting those conversations the minute students walk in the door. How is this environment different than your high school environment? And how does social media that you're bringing from high school, how do you need to think about it differently? How do you need to think about how you're using it and how it's impacting you when your mom is not taking it out of your hand when you go to bed or whatever else is happening at home?
So to sum up, we have the knowledge. Let's use academic spaces to impart this knowledge. We do this already to a certain extent, but Susan, let me make a pitch for perhaps incorporating a class on the art of conversation or the art of living in 21st century society as part of a DANET curriculum.
It's actually very interesting you raised that. I met with a group of students yesterday, and I threw the general education question at them, you know, what do you think we should have? And I asked, you know, is there any required class do you think we should have? And their response was adulting 101.
Yeah.
How do you manage a budget? How do you pay your taxes? How do you advocate for yourself with your landlord or your doctor or in your job and so on? And this seems to be sort of part and parcel of exactly that. So anyway, let's thank Zizi and Alexis and Adrienne for a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.